This is the Resident Evil 4 remake towards the end of development. At this point in development, RE4 Remake had just went through one of the most grueling reboots in the history of the franchise. Capcom spent years of work on the most anticipated remake in gaming history and completely rebooted it mid-development. What started out as a project that was more or less supposed to be outsourced to a studio that was practically built for the sole purpose of remaking Resident Evil games, eventually had to be brought back in-house to Capcom's very own Division 1 development team. This is the very turbulent development story of Resident Evil 4 Remake, and just somehow, someway, Capcom always finding a way to ship absolute bangers. Welcome to PM Films, where we dedicate videos to talking about the side of gaming that studios don't want you to hear. If you enjoy the content this channel has to offer and value transparency in game development, please hit subscribe, as that goes a long way in having these important stories visible to more people. Before we get into the development of the remake, we need to very briefly talk about the development of the original, because everything that made this remake so terrifying to build is baked into the 2005 game's own history. Development of the original RE4 started back in '99, and 4 complete versions were built and thrown away before release. The very first one, directed by Hideki Kamiya, drifted so far into stylish action territory that Mikami spun it off into its entirely new franchise. That's literally how Devil May Cry was born. The later attempts included a gothic fog version and a back-to-basics zombie version, and the infamous Hookman version shown at E3 2003, before Mikami finally took the director's chair himself and rebuilt everything around a Spanish village and a mind-controlling parasite called Las Plagas, and a revolutionary over-the-shoulder camera. So keep that in mind for everything that follows. Resident Evil 4 was already a game that was defined by reboots and scrapped visions long before the remake's story. RE4 launched as the crown jewel of Capcom's GameCube exclusive Capcom 5 lineup, and Mikami was so committed to Nintendo that he famously declared he'd cut his own head off, Japanese slang for quitting his job if the game were ever to hit another platform. Capcom announced a PS2 port 2 months before the GameCube version ever shipped. Mikami apologized to fans, eventually left Capcom and went to co-found what would become Platinum Games. Platinum eventually comes back to the story in just a few moments. And that PS2 port, to sweeten it, Capcom created a brand new Ada Wong bonus campaign called Separate Ways. When RE4 finally shipped in January 2005, it completely rewired the entire industry. That over-the-shoulder camera became the default template for basically every third-person action game that followed. And the game had sold over 15 million copies lifetime across a comical number of platforms. That is what Capcom eventually decided to remake. A game where one wrong decision doesn't just disappoint fans, it changes exactly what fans expect from a Resident Evil game.
Take care of yourself, buddy.
So how does a company work up the nerve to touch the original games? Well, Capcom decided to do one remake at a time, as you know. On August 12th of 2015, Capcom officially greenlit RE2's remake after literal years of fans begging for it, and would subsequently land in January of 2019, built on Capcom's new RE engine, and it quickly became a critical and commercial monster. I have a whole video dedicated to the development of RE2 that you should check out after this, but the gist of it is that every decision Capcom made on the development of the Resident Evil 4 remake flows from this proof of concept. Rebuilding a classic from the ground up, respect what made it work, and modernize everything else. The remake machine was officially online for Capcom, starting with the RE2 remake. Then came the RE3 remake in 2020, and this is where the machine hit a bit of a speed bump. RE3 was built in just about a year with heavy support from external studios, and it launched barely 12 months after RE2. Because that backlash, it directly shaped every decision made about the RE4 remake going forward and nearly broke the project in half. Here's the thing that people don't really realize. The RE4 remake was already in development before RE3 remake even shipped. According to reporting from VGC, work started all the way back in 2018, and it wasn't being led by Capcom's internal teams at all. It was in the hands of a brand new, Osaka-based studio called M2, founded by Tatsuya Minami, the former head of Platinum Games. I told you earlier that connection was coming back. M2 was stacked with ex-Capcom and ex-Platinum veterans, and according to VGC sources, the studio was primarily set up for one purpose: this remake. M2 even cut its teeth providing support work on the RE3 remake, which was essentially a warm-up lap before the main event. And Capcom's ambitions went even further. According to a report from Fanbyte's Imran Khan, part of the plan behind partnering with M2 was to lure Shinji Mikami himself back to direct the remake of his own magnum opus, reuniting him with his old colleague Minami. This was the dream scenario for Capcom, the original creator returning to the game that made him a legend. Mikami reportedly considered the offer and turned it down because he believed his own studio, Tango Gameworks, would fall apart if he left. So the fairy tale ending died on the table and M2 carried on without him. For a while, all of this was one of gaming's worst kept secrets. Insiders like Dusk Golem were openly discussing the project right down to its internal codename, Chainsaw, and claiming Capcom was deliberately taking the RE3 criticism on board. Voice actor DC Douglas, the longtime voice of Albert Wesker, even claimed that he was playing Wesker in the remake and shared concept art before nuking his entire Twitter account. Capcom itself was out here posting cryptic teases like 4, itchy, tasty, a riff on the most famous diary entry in Resident Evil history. Everybody knew this wasn't a secret at that point. And then in November of 2020, the secret was exposed entirely. Capcom was hit with a massive ransomware attack, refused to pay the ransom, and in retaliation, the hackers dumped the entire company's internal release roadmap onto the internet. Sitting right there in the leak schedule, Resident Evil 4 Remake, targeting late 2022. Capcom never wanted you to know this game existed yet, however, the internet knew everything about it. What the internet didn't know is how troubled the RE4 Remake's development was actually going through at the time. So in late 2020, the Resident Evil 3 remake just launched to a wave of backlash over cut content, but behind the scenes, Studio M2 has already spent 2 years quietly building RE4 Remake. A leak pegs the target release for 2022. Then, Capcom holds an internal review and the whole thing gets blown up. In January 2021, VGC dropped a report that the project had suffered a massive shakeup. M2's role was gutted and Capcom's heavy-hitting Division 1, the team behind the mainline RE and Devil May Cry, were brought in to hijack the project and build it from scratch. So why the sudden fallout? Well, it was Capcom's knee-jerk reaction to RE3's reception. M2 and Capcom saw fans tearing RE3 apart for leaving stuff out, so their strategy for RE4 was playing it completely safe to keep it one-to-one without cutting anything. Capcom's internal leads wanted the exact opposite. They wanted to use 2005 as a launchpad, not a blueprint, reshaping the story and environments to give the remakes its own identity. It was two totally incompatible philosophies, and Capcom wasn't about to lose an argument over their own flagship game. M2 got sidelined and the project hit the reset button, and the release date quietly slipped to 2023. By early 2022, Fanbyte filled in the blanks on what Division 1 was actually doing with the game. They were leaning way harder into horror and setting huge chunks of it at night, and even pitching a pitch black version of the iconic village fight. Not every single rumor made it to the final cut. For example, the village fight stayed in the daylight, fortunately, but you could still kind of see the shift in the final game. It's meaner, darker, and way more oppressive than the campy vibes of the original. So who does Capcom hand the wheels to after benching the studio that was literally created for this game? Well, the RE2 Remake Dream Team. Yasuhiro Anpo as the main director, with Kazunori Kadoi directing alongside him. and Yoshiaki Hirabayashi producing. But the funny part is that neither director wanted anything to do with this game. In Game Informer's cover story, Anpo flat out said, "Honestly speaking, I didn't want to do it," explaining that the original had become a legend even beyond the RE series, and that one wrong move with any change would enrage its fans. Kodoi felt the exact same. His gut reaction to hearing about the project was that you don't remake a masterpiece because there's nowhere to go but down. Something that Halo Studios honestly should have taken a playbook out of, but that's a whole different thing. If you want to see my Halo video, I have that up as well, but back to RE for a minute. The two most qualified people on the planet for this job just looked at the project and decided that they didn't really want to do it, but they went through with it anyway. From early 2021 onward, this was Division 1's production, with the huge chunk of the RE2 remake team returning and external studio K2 providing additional development support. And the design philosophy that emerged was basically the perfect synthesis of M2's caution and Capcom's ambition. The director's first big decision, according to that Game Informer cover story, was accepting that they could not catch lightning in a bottle twice. So instead, the plan became to stay largely faithful to the original, then fold in every evolution the series had learned in 17 years since, and let those two things combine into a new kind of Resident Evil game. Hirabayashi also drew a line in the sand that was clearly aimed directly at the RE3 wound. The remake would be just as long as the original, with no cut down, no shorter but dense excuses. The team played through the original back to front, looking for anything they can tweak, flesh out, or outright fix. The story was an easy starting point for them. They kept a core character's vibe intact, but gave Leon, Ashley, and Lewis way more breathing room through deeper cutscenes and lore drops. However, the original 2005 game is practically built on press X to not die, the QuickTime events that we hated, and Capcom scrapped them fairly early on, mostly because around this time in the early 2020s, nobody liked QuickTime events, so immediately it became one of the first things to be cut. Removing QuickTime events solved one issue, but it immediately triggered another. How do you handle the iconic Krauser fight, which was literally just a giant QuickTime event cutscene? Their workaround accidentally spawned the best mechanic in the entire game. They built a new dedicated knife parry system so you could actually fight Krauser manually. Once they felt how good it was, they realized that there should be no reason why they limit this to just one boss, and baked the parry into the whole game. The director of the game even admitted that even after testing it, he'd go back to the 2005 original and find himself instinctively trying to parry attacks that were never parryable back then. Kodoi personally fine-tuned the knife mechanics, including the durability system, which keeps you from deflecting a full-blown chainsaw with a pocket knife for free. The rest of the redesign followed that same mindset. To tackle a game this big, Capcom split the team into 3 distinct groups, with each group owning a major act: the village, the castle, or the island. Ashley got the biggest overhaul of all. Instead of feeling like a giant walking escort mission penalty, they turned her into a partner. They scrapped the constant health bar babysitting entirely, swapping it for simple commands so she either stays glued to your back or gives you some breathing room. Visually, they used RE7 and Village as their baseline for what a modern RE game should look like. In fact, Village was a major influence across the board. The new merchant side quests were inspired directly by hunting down recipe ingredients for the Duke. To keep the replayability sky high, which the team saw as the original's secret sauce, they kept adding branching routes, extra player options, and a dedicated stealth mechanic, complete with the new bolt thrower for silent kills. For the directors, the light bulb moment came during playtesting. They realized they couldn't stop playing their own builds, which was exactly the same high they felt while making the RE2 remake. That's when they knew they had a hit. The cast came together with the same faithful but new energy. Nick Apostolides returned as Leon, carrying the role over from the RE2 remake and the Netflix series Infinite Darkness, now playing the jaded version of the character. Ashley went to Genevieve Buchner, a TV show actress who I hope I didn't butcher her last name, from shows like The 100, making her video game debut on one of the most scrutinized characters in the entire series. So with all this momentum building internally, it was finally time to unveil RE4 Remake to the world. After nearly 4 years of development across 2 studios and 1 partial reboot, Capcom finally made it official. On June 2nd of 2022, during a PlayStation State of Play, the Resident Evil 4 remake was revealed to the world with a locked-in release date of March 2023. And unlike most modern AAA reveals, they actually hit their release date. Capcom described their approach as reimagining the game's storyline while preserving the essence of what made it special, which, after everything you now know about the M2 situation, reads like a peace treaty between the 2 development philosophies. Then, right before launch, Capcom made a great marketing move. After teasing it at a February State of Play, they shadow dropped a free demo on March 9th called the Chainsaw Demo, which was actually Capcom's internal codename for the Resident Evil 4 remake. And this wasn't a short time demo either. It covered the entire opening through the legendary Village Square fight, had no time limit, and could be replayed infinitely. It even had a secret, a brutal, randomly triggered difficulty called Mad Chainsaw Mode, where Dr. Salvador shows up juiced out of his mind swinging a flaming chainsaw. The demo went over so well that Capcom itself, in an official press release, credited its reception as one of the drivers of the game's launch sales. Demos for Capcom are their way of marketing their game and garnering hype, and it absolutely worked for the RE4 remake. Which brings us to release. Resident Evil 4 Remake launched on March 24th, 2023, and it was an instant landslide. Critically, it landed among the top 3 highest rated games of 2023 on Metacritic, and commercially, it sold over 3 million copies in its first 2 days, one of the biggest launches in the franchise's entire history. And it became the series' biggest Steam debut ever, peaking at over 168,000 concurrent players and blowing past Village, RE2, and RE3. And by 2 weeks in, it was nearly at 4 million sales. However, there was a slight problem because 2 weeks after launch, on April 7th, the beloved Mercenaries mode arrived as a free upgrade, which was great on paper. However, it came with the very important caveat that there would be 11 paid exclusive upgrade ticket microtransactions, letting players skip the weapon upgrade grind for around $3 each. The community rightfully torched it, and honestly, sneaking pay to progress into a single player game that was already selling millions is pretty annoying. Thankfully, the tickets are completely ignorable, but it remains one asterisk on an otherwise immaculate launch. By September 2023, the game had cleared 5 million copies, and then Capcom decided to go all in. On September 21st, they released the Separate Ways DLC, which was a full Ada Wong campaign for $10. And this is where the whole story folds in on itself. Remember how Separate Ways was originally the bonus mode Capcom created for the PS2 port, the port that made Mikami threaten to quit altogether? Well, Separate Ways brought basically all of it back, weaving the cut content into Ada's side of the story so naturally that it felt planned from day one. After everything that happened with RE3, Capcom wasn't restoring cut content, they were closing out the loop on the exact criticism that started the whole development saga. The DLC scored a ridiculous 89 on Metacritic, and as a $10 add-on, it reviewed better than most full-priced games that year. And Capcom still wasn't done. That December, they dropped an entire VR mode for the full campaign on PSVR 2 completely free, plus native ports to iPhone and Mac. On the awards side, the remake was nominated for Game of the Year at the Game Awards and won PlayStation's Game of the Year at the Golden Joysticks, and only lost the Golden Joysticks Ultimate Game of the Year to a little indie darling called Baldur's Gate 3. However, losing Game of the Year to Baldur's Gate 3 in 2023 is less of a defeat and more of a natural disaster because like nobody was going to survive that. Let me know in the comments if you want a Baldur's Gate 3 video, by the way. The long tail might be more impressive than the actual launch. By April 2025, Capcom had announced that the remake had crossed 10 million copies sold, the fastest any Resident Evil game had ever hit that mark. Analysts estimate that it had generated over $560 million, making it the best-selling remake of this console generation, and more than tripling the sales of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Oblivion Remastered. The machine Capcom built for the RE4 remake is now running the entire franchise. This is a remake of a game that was originally rebooted 4 times, and of course one of them became Devil May Cry. Development began secretly in 2018 at an external studio built specifically for this project, run by an ex-Platinum Games boss. Capcom tried and failed to bring back Shinji Mikami, had all of their internal plans get leaked by a ransomware attack, and also addressed the RE3 remake criticism head-on. Capcom's reward to the team for pulling off this impossible stunt was just assigning them to another one. The 2 reluctant directors are now heading up the Code Veronica remake, scheduled for next year, which I will absolutely cover in its own video. The developers who swore they didn't want to touch a masterpiece are now Capcom's permanent remake team. Is it one of the best remakes ever made? Or does the 2005 original hold up better? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.